Oh,
Oh, hey.
hey. Good morning, everybody. How the heck are we doing today?
I am doing great.
Oh, it is so good seeing everyone. We are here doing Fabric Fridays. This is number three. So we're old hands at this by now.
You would
But
hope.
uh, welcome everyone. Fabric Fridays. Me and Kevin got together. We were talking. You know what? There's so much to explore and know about fabric. We wanted to explore it, and we wanted to do that with you so that we could all be learning together on this journey. So thank you for everyone who's joining us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and well, those two streaming services. Excited to have you guys here today. Kevin, how are you doing?
I am doing great. Wonderful. What I like about doing this on Fridays is it means we made it to Friday. it's
Amen,
the
right?
it's the end of the week. I think it's a good timing to kind of take some time to explore. And if you're kind of like me, then you kind of set up to what you might be doing a little bit into the weekend. So um, yeah, it's great. Great to be here. So wonderful things that I know I've seen about fabric all over the social medias this last week. Still a lot of buzz about it. Just loving it. So
Yeah, exciting stuff. And so, no matter where you are, so if you're joining us, we want to hear where you're from. So post in the comments either on LinkedIn or Twitter. Like, where are you located? Are you in the U.S.? Are you out? What state are you in? And I would also really love to hear what has your exposure been to fabric? Like on
mhm.
a scale of 1 to 10, are you deep in and like, hey, I'm like everything, and on a 10, I've been watching all the videos and trying to hang in there. I've been running the demos, or are you at a 1, which is like 99.99999% of the population? Like, I don't even know what fabric is. So
Mhm.
post that into the channel as well. Love to get that information about for you guys. Right.
Yeah, still having a lot of conversations with people of just how do I get started? What is in there? I refer them back to our video from last week. There's many others of getting started, but it's definitely a journey. People just can't feel all. I mean, you're going to feel overwhelmed, and I guess that's okay. But it is a journey, and it's just going to be a step at a time. And what is it that you say, Chris? Become 1% better than the day before,
That is
and
exactly right.
everything will be great. So, yep.
Yep. Yep. The amount you can improve in the course of the year if you just focus in on making yourself a little bit better every day is just astronomical. Change your life. So
And that's why people are here now. So,
awesome. All right. Well,
well,
let's
let's.
get 1% better together. So, Kevin, you had something very interesting that we were talking about earlier this week. And, because a lot of people, and what we talked about last week, a lot of people have been really focused in and talking about the lake house, and lake house, awesome, great way to get started. But what the heck is this thing called the SQL DW? Why would you
Mhm.
use it? Why not? I think we want to get more into that and understanding why is this a vital component inside of the Microsoft Fabric space?
Yeah, yeah. So I think today we're going to focus on getting deeper into that. Do you want to do a little bit of house cleaning first? And I know
Oh,
pricing was announced. Uh, maybe it might have been out when we did our broadcast last week, but we didn't have a time to consume it.
yeah, and and
Um,
and actually, let's quick do a few other things. Oh, I gotta change off my graphics here. Hold on. Okay, we do have a few rules because we are here to answer your questions. So let's learn together on this. But rule number one, we are inheriting from Guy in the Cube and Matthew Roach. Please prefix any questions you have with the queue so that we can queue those up and address those questions as best we can. Rule number two, please do not spam questions. If you spam them, we're going to remove them from the queue. We're not going to answer those questions. So ask it once. And like if we lose it, we may ask you again, but we'll prompt you on asking those again before we get into it. So please do ask those questions. Just prefix the question with the queue so we can get up and running. Okay. But Kevin, you had a great point. We should talk about pricing, right?
right. Yeah. So last week the pricing came out, and so I see you switch over to my screen, and let's focus in on this a little bit. So there's going to be a couple components to the overall cost of fabric. The main one's going to be what I have up on the screen here right now, which is your size that you pick for the capacity, and then how much you end up paying. So let's zoom in just a little bit on the top ones. The smallest one being this F2, and you get these two capacity units. So capacity units is going to be a measurement of consumption, right? How much CPU you used. If you kind of think about when you're designing your own machine at home, your laptop, whatever, that's going to be the CPU, how much power that you have. It doesn't equate one for one with that, but I think it's a concept that we could all kind of understand. And then there's so much that you pay per hour, right? So it's a pay as you go model right now. There's going to be another model that comes out that will be if you commit to a year, then the pricing will come down some. But if you go with the pay as you go, you're going to have at this level, the F2 level, 36 cents per hour. And so that comes out at this $262.80 per month. Now, there's been some discussion about since it is pay as you go, and it is up in Azure, you'll be able to turn these things on and off in order to save some money. One of the things that I did also see, and I haven't found all the research or a good document on it yet, but there's this idea of when you're running a workload, the workload could burst, say, in doing your transformation process. And it could use more capacity units than you actually have available. And Microsoft's going to allow that to still run and finish. They're going to use as much compute as needed to get the good performance and get the job done. But that's going to get spread out over the rest of the hours of your day. So if you burst and then you turn off, I believe you're still going to get charged for even though you're off, because you have your bursting time going to be spread out over the days. So we'll try to find more articles, keep following that on how that's going to work. But in theory, if you're just doing development or you're just exploring or whatever, and you want to buy an F2, you should be able to come in at or below this price every single month. Now, the next thing that's going to be very important to understand is the storage. Let's see if I could get this that looks good. Okay. So the storage is going to be built separately, and it's built real close to what Azure Data Lake Storage is today. So that's, I always have a hard time saying this. In dollars, it's $0.023. So in cents, that would be 2.3 cents per gigabyte per month. Very, very cheap, right? Storage has always been told to be cheap lately. So
And can I say that is a huge advantage that we have inside of Fabric is this ability to separate out our compute purchases and our spend and our storage purchases and spend. All right. So
mhm,
no longer are these combined together. And if you're just coming from like a Power BI world, you're like, what are you talking about? Storage hasn't been a thing. Well, it's not much of a thing when you think about analytics, but when you get into data engineering personas or data science personas, they have huge scale needs to like have petabytes of data that they're
right,
accessing and using, right? And
right,
and that is 100% something that they do all the time every day, right?
right.
Again, the advantage is now we only pay for what we use when it comes to storage, and on the compute side we have this ability to either buy we're buying blocks of compute that we can start and stop, or we have these like scaled amounts of compute that are spread out over the
Mhm.
day, so it makes it much easier for us to manage our environments without having to be if you don't have those resources to tightly control your scale up, scale down capabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's going to be important. I see a comment on the chat that talks about it would be good to see how much space is in use, and I tend to agree with that. I think in a future episode we'll kind of get into the administration part. I'm going to make a note on that to look into how to find out how much space is in use in total. I don't think that I've seen that yet. The other thing I did want to
There's a
talk.
lot of
Go ahead.
reporting content that's still coming out.
Hmm.
They're still working on this. I'm not sure it's a secret, but One Lake, which I think is so foundational with Microsoft Fabric, that was something that was like, oh yeah, we have to have this. It was
Hmm.
kind of like the last one to like come into the mix. So there is, we're missing some of those features like that out there. They're going to get all of that together. I spoke with Josh Kaplan
Hmm.
and Elizabeth Oldig earlier this week. uh, they're very aware of these needs and they're working on getting those out for us as well.
Yep. So the last thing I do want to point out is
Hmm.
this last two sentences in here, right? That's talking about data transfer on the network, where it says it's cross region and other charges may apply, and then you
Hmm.
need to learn more about the bandwidth pricing, right? And I think you might have touched a little bit on this in some of your earlier ones or whatever, maybe not. The concept of ingress and egress, right?
Yep.
Uh, Typically, pushing data in is the cloud providers don't charge for that, but moving data out, whether it's cross region or even back down into your machine, is typically going to get hit with network bandwidth charges. And so one of the questions that came out at the end of last Friday's conversation is where I was showing the One Lake add-on into File Explorer. And it was like, hey, does this mean we could just copy files up? And yes, you can just copy files up. You won't get hit with bandwidth pricing at that point. But if you start changing and try to use One Lake as you use OneDrive, then every time you open, say you move an Excel file up there, every time somebody opens that Excel file, that's going to be charges, network charges coming out. It may not be high, but it could add up. So just be aware of that. Don't switch to try to use the One Lake add-ons or whatever as a replacement for OneDrive, right? Don't try to consolidate the two. Use them for their purposes so you don't get charged incorrectly.
Well, and that's a good point, Kevin. So the purpose is OneDrive is for personal utilization, usage
Hmm.
of files, right? One Lake is for data analytics, data engineering, data science functionality,
Right.
right? So two separate things. Keep those in mind, and uh, you're going to be just fine.
Yep. So that's all I have on licensing. Do we want to kind of start switching our conversation into the SQL endpoint and data
Yeah.
warehousing?
Yes, let's do that. But before we get into that, let's talk about these different components. Okay, so
Let's
when
do it.
I bring in content from or when I bring in data, I'm first going to land it into the space, and then it's going to be um, uh, delivered, and it's going to be available in a lake house. What is
Maybe.
this? What is the SQL DW component of that?
So I think we need to continue having a different conversation and using the words that Microsoft is using for the
Okay.
SQL endpoint
Okay.
versus the SQL versus the warehouse that they're calling it. Okay, because they
Okay.
are two different things and they have two different purposes. And I think the normal pattern is going to be close to what you're talking about. A lot of people are going to set up a lake house and pull that lake house data in, and then start going to a warehouse from there. But you could pull data directly into the warehouse and not have a lake house at all. So there are going to be other patterns that keep coming up with this. So if you notice, I have this article up, and you notice Microsoft does make this separation of SQL endpoint and warehouse. And
Okay.
always on Microsoft's articles, look to see what it applies to up here, so you could kind of understand the context of the article. Did you have something, Chris?
No, I was just honestly, I wasn't making a differentiation between the SQL endpoint of the Lakehouse and the DW. So,
Yeah,
uh,
let me jump down to this graphic right here because this kind of sums it up for me really well. Oops, I did that twice now. Plus,
Yeah,
okay, much
Mark's
bigger.
Mark Walters is even pointing out that they seem to be using warehouse and endpoint interchangeably, and
Yeah, they do, and I think we ought to start calling them out on that where the documentation needs to be enhanced a little bit. Sorry, hang
okay,
on. Didn't want to cough into the mic, but this slide here to me really helps quite a bit because I've heard them talk about this, um,
Mm,
and it's this read only part. So when we have a lake house, and when you stand up, create a brand new lake house, you're going to see a object that's out there that's going to have the same icon as the warehouse, but it's going to be labeled SQL endpoint. And that's going to allow you to use the T-SQL that you know and love. This is one of the big reasons for going to a data warehouse is, again, reusing a skill set that you already have. And we'll keep touching on that. But you're going to be able to use T-SQL. But you notice this is, I'm going to zoom just a little bit, read only.
mm,
Okay. So when you're using the SQL endpoint, you're not going to be able to make changes to the data. So right now, whichever engine created the data is the engine that's going to change the data.
okay,
So you got to really kind of keep that in mind. If you created it through a lakehouse and used Spark, you're going to use Spark to update that data later on. If you're using the warehouse, you're using T-SQL that we all know and love. There's so much T-SQL skill sets out there. Then you're going to use that approach later on when you want to modify that data, right? Now,
yep,
any one of them could read it because it's all in the same Delta format. And you hear that message quite a bit, right? Is, hey, we're putting everything into one format so everything could read it. 100% true, but make sure we understand that it is at the read level, not the read write level.
oh, that makes sense. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we have a few questions that are coming in. Let's turn over to those quick before we go too far here. Jack is asking, has Microsoft published a calculator to estimate all of these moving pieces? Um, uh, uh, I'm going to say not to my knowledge, and I believe that's something they've talked about doing. But I think they really want to lock in and get the reserve pricing defined and out there and available, and at that point in time, do that calculator. Kevin, do you know of one that's out?
Yeah, I have not seen one yet. If they do put it out there, I think it's going to go to the normal Azure calculator, but I haven't seen anything.
Okay,
Um, I say that, but I almost felt I ran into one the other day, but I didn't mark it. So,
okay.
I'll look a little bit closer at some of the links that I've opened up and see if we could find it and come back. But I'm not aware of it off the top of my head.
Yep. And then Donald Parrish is asking, DW may cost more than Spark Lakehouse compute. Um,
That's a good question. So that's going to be, and I think it's going to remain a black box to us, right? Because you noticed in the pricing, what we just had up a little while ago, they call this stuff capacity units, and they've used this in other services in the past, like DTUs is against databases and stuff like that, and it's always, well, how do you calculate that? And that's a little bit of a secret. They exposed a smit of that, just a little bit, not much, but that's kind of their secret sauce on how they're going to figure out what to charge you. So, does it take up more compute or not? I don't know, Donald, but
uh,
that I've seen as much
uh,
compute as they need to get your job done and give you performance. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
I'm gonna say it depends.
Yes.
All right.
I don't know who's tracking it on this one. So.
It's going to depend on how you define and build and manage whatever resources you have.
You bet.
Spark can be hugely can be built so it consumes a ton of resources, right?
Hmm.
It's very bursty. You can define processes that just run and just draw Spark compute, or you can build out processes that are highly efficient and effective. So
Yeah.
a lot of this is really going to depend upon your usage scenarios. I will say that the SQL DW warehouse that we're talking about today, that exists inside Fabric, is not the SQL DW or the Synapse warehouse that people have been using for the last 5 or 6 years. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
this has been rewritten almost from scratch, from what I understand, to give us better performance, scalable performance, so that we're really getting the power of an MPP platform broadly across users that come in and use it. Mim did a great deep dive into the performance of
Mm-hmm.
SQL DW, or I'm sorry, the Synapse data warehouse that exists inside of Fabric. It's
Yeah.
no longer, two separate things. You're not talking just like on demand and like always on. It is now, or serverless and
It was
whatever.
serverless and dedicated. Yeah.
Yes,
Where
that
serverless had you had to have a built-in serverless pool, and then you would pay for a dedicated pool, and that was your MPP. And they've kind of blended those two together.
yep,
We are seeing things that from the MPP architecture, and that is coming through. So you could tell a lot of it was based upon that. But that makes sense, right? I mean, the
yep,
way that they're doing parquet and stuff. And we're going to touch on a couple of the things as we get further into the demo on why something comes up from, why one thing in particular we have planned for you, and I'll explain why it's there. So
yep. Well, and then we have one last question here. We'll quick get on, and that's coming from Raphael. Does SQL endpoint automatically create views to Delta Parquets? Kevin, do you want to answer that one?
yeah, so I'm gonna pick on the word views. You're not gonna see it underneath the views object, but what the SQL endpoint does is it gives you access to read those tables through T-SQL, and you could use the three-part naming um, against the lakehouse object, because again, the SQL endpoint is whenever you're going against the lakehouse, not the warehouse side.
Yep.
But you can create using the three-part. It's like another database, right? So you're going to have the lakehouse name .dbo .table, and it's going to actually be a table, not a view. In the SQL endpoint, you cannot store views because it's only, again, it's just the read only, and it doesn't support DML or DDL. It doesn't support either of those two. But let's see, because I think there's a comparison down here. So maybe it was a good time to get into this. Hopefully, Chris, this shows well enough. I don't have to zoom in on this. We have up top is the warehouse, the SQL endpoint, and then data marts. And we're just going to focus on these first two columns. Those are both things that exist inside Fabric. So you could see what the primary capabilities are, where it's asset compliant, full warehousing with transaction support in T-SQL. That to me is big, is transaction support. So if you wanted to do something in a stored procedure, and yes, the warehouse allows you to create and manage stored procedures, and everything in that stored procedure, you're updating multiple objects, and you want it all within a transaction, that's supported. That to me is huge. Now, you're not going to get the same type of transaction. You're not going to get transactions at all that I'm aware of in the SQL endpoint side, right? Or even
Yep.
in the Spark engine. I don't know that we'll get into the Lakehouse and Spark later on. I'm not aware of it supporting transactions. Are you,
No,
Chris?
nope. No, not today.
Yeah,
Well,
and
actually, hang on. It support. Uh,
tran changes across multiple objects and rolling all of those objects back at once.
it's ACID compliant.
Yeah, ACID doesn't necessarily mean a transaction though, right? Because what I'm thinking in a transaction is I'm going to be able to change two objects, and if either one of those objects fails, I could roll both of them back.
Okay.
But
Well,
ACID is
maybe.
within the one object, I think. So
Okay, maybe we're unclear.
sounds like something we'll have to come back to next week.
Yeah, I'll have to
Um,
test that out.
so,
S- s-
the developer profiles are different. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was going to say one of the big things I think is the difference here, and maybe you're getting right into this here, is the difference in the technology that's behind these two different uh, uh, these two different points. So we're talking data marts is SQL Server. So that means
Hmm.
all of your referential integrity, everything you know is going to be available inside of data marts either now or at some point in time in the future. It's going to be a real lightweight or user friendly way to instantiate, create, and use a SQL database, right?
Right.
When you talk about data warehouses, you're talking about MPP platforms, and there's additional effort that goes into building and managing an MPP platform that a lot of business users and a lot of people who work with data aren't going to necessarily be rushing to address, and maybe that's where you're going.
Yeah, I don't know that I was headed there. So if you
Oh,
want to
okay.
continue down, but
All right.
I think you're right because there are some different things around the MPP. What I was trying to get to was, and I see some of it still being talked into the chat, right?
Mm-hmm.
About these. Let me move up a little bit, and then I will focus it in on this one for the question that was out there, right?
Yep.
So on the warehouse side, it's full data query language, full data manipulation language, and data definition language. So that means I could do queries, I could do uh, insert, update, delete, I could do create table, create views, create store procedures. Here on the SQL endpoint side, we have full data query language, but no DML and limited data definition in the T-SQL, such as SQL views and table value functions. So I haven't gotten into on this side exactly what views we can produce. So, um,
So that
but it
is
seems,
actually pretty nice. I was
yeah,
doing some of that exploration earlier last week. So if you
on
have a data
the
mart,
endpoint.
yeah, like let's say you're using a SQL server as a data mart inside like Azure SQL or even on-prem, and you wanted to take this and take advantage of the lakehouse capabilities because you're looking to mix in some like a medallion architecture to help with your processing and building. This works out really good because it's super easy to dump all your tables out into CSVs, then define them inside of a lakehouse, and then take any views you have, put them on top of your SQL endpoint, and you're off to the races. That worked out
Hmm.
great for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, and I experimented a while ago with the SQL views because one of the challenges that I keep having is we can't use spaces in our column names because of the Parquet format. So I think we could use views to overcome that and get those views into our data set or even into our default data set. Still more to come on whether that performs just as well. I need to test that part out, but I have been able to successfully get that into the default data set and be able to reset my names to have spaces within the names. I think I did that through the data warehouse side. I don't have that exercise up. I might be able to find it in one place, but we'll see
Okay.
how much time we have
Well, and
remaining.
Raphael does bring out a good point about the SQL endpoint is great for making data available for other purposes than a data set without copying the data. If you're
Yeah.
using a lakehouse and a medallion with the SQL DW at the end, you do have to load that SQL DW, right? That is something that it has to get loaded in. Um, that's how you gain the efficiencies of how that works and the ability to write and modify content. So be aware that there is a load step that has to come as part of that.
Yeah, and I think his point was right. You can also use the stuff from in the warehouse. You could use the data from the lake house without having to reload it. So
Wait, you can? I thought you
yeah.
had to.
Oh yeah, no, you could do cross query joins to what's in your lake house by doing the 3-part naming. So you
Well,
don't have to
gosh, moving so
transfer it.
fast here.
Yeah, you don't have to transfer it from your lake house to your warehouse. Those, because it's all in one lake, it is
Awesome.
accessible. Um, and we'll see if, I think we're going to get into the lake house maybe next week. And I'll see if I can kind of put a demo together with that. But yeah, there's very easy ways without having to reload it. Now you might want to reload it depending on the transformations that you're doing into the warehouse. Um, but I've even looked at it as a way that you could only put views into your data warehouse, and those views could be sitting right on all the data in the lake house. So
Mm.
Donald put a link out there. Thoughts on space?
Oh,
We
from the
get,
Fabric Guru.
yeah, I do like that site. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, let me see if
Yeah,
I
all the
can.
column names. That's what he's talking about. We
Yep.
moved on from that. Okay. So does that kind of help get everybody, or Chris, do you think we've covered enough between, the differences with the warehouse and the SQL endpoint, that there are differences, they're going to be used for different things. Continue to explore upon that. The SQL endpoint is for getting to the data that exists inside your lakehouse. It looks like we can create some views to that. There's going to be very limited DDL type objects on it, where the warehouse is moving towards the full support of T-SQL, a SQL database. Like you mentioned, a lot of people use a smaller, they might be using, say, Azure SQL, or they've been using on-prem SQL or whatever. And there are slight differences in the warehouse because it's an MPP architecture. We'll cover one or two of them here. But for the most part, your skill set's going to transfer over into the warehouse. And that to me is one of the big reasons for using it. Let me find my other.
And actually, Jai has been very patient in asking his question. And before we quick move on, let's cover it. We haven't established a recovery plan or process around the DW, or as of yet inside of Fabric, have we?
So that's an interesting question. And I'm going to reverse it just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
This is a software as a service. Who's responsible for recovery?
Oh, all right, fair enough.
Are we, right? I mean, so the concept of doing database backups, right? Storing those database backups somewhere. Some people might have a need for some of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a conversation that I was involved with some other MVPs, where somebody brought it up that said their requirements, for whatever they work for, whether it's a government organization, financial, something like that, is what I imagine. They didn't expose exactly what that was, but they have to have their data in two places at all times.
Mm-hmm.
So they go through and they do all of their loads, and then they copy the data over to, like say they have it in Microsoft's Azure platform, and then they got to copy it over to AWS, right? And we
Yep.
talked about it in this setup, and what was brought up, that the Microsoft people in the room said, okay, well, think about it. We're going to store everything as Parquet tables, Parquet files with the Delta log over top of it. All you have to do is copy all of that to your other platform, all those files, and there's your redundancy. It's even easier than the database backup and restore, right?
Yeah.
So that could be a technique if you really have to have your data in multiple places. But if you're thinking about DR, and this is funny because one of the clients that I have, they were talking to me about DR just the other day. And I said, well, everything that I have going on in our analytics platform is up on Azure. They go, oh, yeah, we're not worried about that one right now. It's not that you don't have to think about it, right? But they were worried about their on prem stuff. It's a lot less work because we're on software as a service than what we traditionally would have done, right? So
Yeah. Well, and Mim brings up a good question because we're talking about Lakehouse and DW.
Mm-hmm.
He's calling out that, hey, at some point in time, I think these are going to become one thing. And honestly, as you were showing that slide, like, hey, we do these things over here, and then we do these
Mm-hmm.
other things over here. Yeah, that architecturally speaking, those two, the SQL endpoint and the DW, looks like they should collapse all in on themselves to be able to do all of those capabilities and just have that all available to people, right? Like,
Yeah, I agree with. I see what Mim put out there and exactly what you're saying. I truly believe, and I think this is going to be a hill I'm going to be willing to die on for a while, is it's going to come down to the skill sets of the person you have, and maybe even the person you have available at the time,
yeah,
right? Because we have one platform that allows you to work with all of the same data regardless of skill set. If you want to do something, I mean, for the most part, right? Like we're saying, if you produce something in the warehouse, you're not going to be able to modify it through a notebook, right?
yep.
And kind of vice versa. Fine, but you're going to be able to access that data and use that data. So if you have somebody that is a great developer, but they happen to be a T-SQL developer, or somebody else that's a great developer that's a PySpark developer,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get them working together easier than we have in the past, right? That's really what I think that's what's going to evolve out of this whole architecture. um, and it's not going to be all these people that think, oh, I have to learn this or I have to do this. And I could think back to my past of so many times, because I know I know T-SQL very well. I know PySpark just enough to kind of be dangerous, but I've also thought of times where I go, I know T-SQL, but I still think this is a struggle to do this particular task, right? And I would
Mm-hmm.
have loved to be able to jump out to some other coding language to do it a whole lot easier. I think we're going to find that throughout the whole thing. So will they merge more and more? Maybe, probably. Well, I think they'll have a little bit of their purpose, but skill sets and people, right? At the end of the day, that's what it is we want to make people more productive. And if that's using the skill sets they have, then great.
Yep.
So,
And I think one of the best things about Fabric is we're bringing all sorts of people together. So
mhm,
these discrepancies, these disjointed pieces inside of a solution become glaringly apparent when they weren't necessarily glaringly apparent uh, to everyone before, right? So now it's like, oh, hey, these things need to be really collapsed. And because they're all part of the same product and engineering teams, they have some real motivations to do so. So super
mhm,
excited about that, right?
yeah.
All right,
So,
awesome. Kevin, you had some other things. Let's keep
yeah,
going.
we
Yeah.
definitely have. We're going through a lot of documentation this morning. Very little demos, but
Yeah.
I did. I think you shared the link for this one as well, right? This decision guide. This is
Yep.
a nice thing to kind of look through. And again, it's talking the warehouse, the lake house, and the data mart. A lot of what we kind of already covered, right? So in the warehouse, you're always going to be working with structured data. In the lake house, you could work with unstructured, semi-structured, or structured. You got different personas that you're going to work through. Uh, Primary development interface, SQL scripts. Here, you're going to be able to use notebooks and job definitions. Within notebooks, you could use different languages, including Spark SQL, right? So as we keep talking SQL, we will have to give a little bit more qualification on if we're talking T-SQL or Spark SQL. There are slight differences. Again, your
Mm-hmm.
skill sets transfer, but there are slight differences because T-SQL is Microsoft's version of SQL, which is based upon ANSI, but sometimes extends ANSI or goes just a little bit beyond or different than ANSI. We were talking earlier about this, the multi-table transactions, right? And you can
Ah.
see it's called out right here. On the warehouse side, you could do a transaction against multiple tables at one time, but it's not available on the lake house side, or at least not yet, right? So this is that concept of, I'm going to update multiple tables, and if one fails, I want both to fail, so, or be rolled back.
Yep.
And pretty much that kind of helps kind of cover it. So, and again, we talked about the query across the items. The lake house could be used within a warehouse. You could query lake house and warehouse tables, and you could query lake house and warehouse tables on the Spark side as well. All right. Hopefully that kind of helps. So let's get into how you learn this. And let me knock down some of these screens.
Yes, let's head into it.
And I went through, let me see if I could find this one, I think is next. Bring this up. I think you have this link to share as well. So the data warehouse tutorial introduction. And this is a great thing to go through. And you could go through this. And what I also noticed is there's a sample file that they will put into the data warehouse for you. And I'm going to show you both instead of going through all of these, create the workspace, all these steps. I've done all these things. I didn't do I say I did it all, but I didn't do some of the create the report or create a lake house and query across the lake house. But you'll get the picture. And plus, where we're at on time, I think it will be good. Let's get into this. When you go through that tutorial, you're going to come out in your workspace with 3 objects. So you create the warehouse automatically creates a default data set. And during that tutorial, you also have a pipeline. So you're going to get a little bit into Data Factory here. And this is the Data Factory interface. And you can see I've run it once and it succeeded. We're going to cover Data Factory in a future one a little bit deeper, kind of like how we were trying to cover warehouse here a little bit deeper. But just know that you're going to get into it just a little bit. You're going to learn some more of it. All right. So when I go into my worldwide importers warehouse, you're going to see that this looks a lot like your interface to like SQL Server Manager Studio. You're going to have schemas, you're going to have tables, you're going to have views. Maybe I should have warmed this up earlier. Okay.
But hang on, that goes pretty fast, right? I mean, it's not as terrible as like some of those computes I've used in the past. So this looks pretty good.
Yeah, and you can see it's still working through some of the things. I think I deleted a bunch of my data this morning. I didn't on that aggregation table because I wanted to run through. Yeah, so city. Oh, I don't have customer. I don't have data in any of these objects right now, but that's fine. So you could see you could create your own tables, you could create functions, and you could create store procedures. And during the exercise, you will actually create one of the store procedures. You could have views. And I like this, that it saves your queries for you down below. So every one of the queries that I did during the exercise, I went ahead and saved to where I had to create tables. I created a couple extra things because I wanted to modify my tables. But the other way of loading data is this copy into command. And I'm going to go ahead and start this because I didn't load data into, this is going to go into city and into fact. So, so you can see that you don't only have to start from a lake house, as we were talking about earlier. You could go out to, in this case, it's going to some blob storage that Microsoft makes available to everybody. And it's getting a Parquet file and it's doing the copy into my 2 tables just from what they provided. So you could take it from somebody else's lake house, your own public sources, bring things in, right? You might want to explore this copy command. You could write store procedures that do inserts into the tables if you're reading other type of data. hopefully this won't take too much longer. I can't remember how long it took before, but so there's definitely multiple ways to bring the data in.
Well,
Okay.
and because you have all these capabilities, right? These are your stored procedures, all sorts of things you can do to create and manage the stuff. This gets you to that like full on, like classical SQL or DW experience for how you manage it, right?
Mm-hmm. And when you have the stored procedures out here, right, you could have it automatically scripted for you. There you go. That minute and a half
Yeah, that's not bad.
wasn't horrible.
Yeah.
And you can see it tells you the number of records, right? How many records did we put in? That seems like a lot. I don't remember it being that many records.
Well, that's why it took so long.
You could be right, but now see, let's do this. Do I have a query that is my count? I don't. I'm going to do just new query, select top 100, and I'm going to change that real quick to asterisk so we could see how many records it has out here. And it did. It's quite a bit, actually, more than I thought.
Yeah, and I think Raphael and Donald had a few comments that make sense. And in this case, Raphael's saying, yeah, so we're copying from one parquet to another. That is kind of correct. And because, well, what Donald's comment is, while we're hoping to use shortcuts for many, many things, there are times and situations where that doesn't make sense, right? When you have to actually modify that data, when you have, like, everyone talks about this concept of ETL, extract, transform, load, right? Uh, and like, okay, we're going from that's the old world. We're going to extract, load, transform. The reality, I think, of a lot of those situations is if you're not, if the last step is not load, you're relying upon some very like uh, uh, varying amounts of compute in order to get that performance on that last step. If you have to do heavy transformations, heavy cleansing and those processes, if you're not storing that data at the end of all of those activities, if you haven't loaded it at the end, performance is going to be an issue. And so that's why always having a link, or you want to link whenever and wherever possible, so you can dramatically cut down on the number of copies that you're storing, right? You just if the data is as it is, have the one copy, right? If your view transformation, or if the transformations are lightweight, like you want to add in spaces, right? Or something along those lines, great, do that without copying the data. But if you're going to have to do these huge transformations, you're going to have to do that load as your final step, right?
Yeah. Or if you wanted to create views, right? Because like you said, it's extremely lightweight. You're just adding some calculated column in, and you don't want to persist that, right? That it calculates fast enough or something, through a view, and you want to bring that into your data set. One of the things I wanted to mention a lot earlier as well is I had a conversation yesterday with some people about paginated reports. And I don't know about you, Chris, but whenever I've produced, the old SSRS reports, now paginated reports, I really like taking my queries out of the paginated report file and having them in either a stored procedure or a view.
Yep.
This is going to help us do that with paginated reports against the OneLake. And that would be the way that I would currently recommend to try to do that, is always have your paginated report when you're hitting your warehouse, or when you want to hit data in OneLake, go through a warehouse, use views, use stored procedures, and pull your queries out so you can test them independently. It's just a great development technique.
I agree completely.
So as we have our default model here, and we just have our 4 tables that we have up here. And what you'll notice is there's no relationships to these tables yet. And I could sit here and I could pull in my relationships or whatever. But one of the things that I did notice is the warehouse does support creating primary keys and foreign keys. Now, these primary keys and foreign keys are going to be, I need to scroll over a little bit. Oh, here it is. You can see over here, you need to define them as not enforced. So it's not going to do the checking to make sure your data is valid, like what a standard SQL server could do. And this is one of the artifacts that have moved over from the MPP type, the dedicated pools, or used to be known as parallel data warehouse in the years past. They've never enforced primary keys.
Yep.
Um, so,
And actually, that's a big one.
yeah, that is.
If you're coming from a business user background or a SQL Server or an Oracle background, and you're starting to work with DWs or lake houses, knowing that even if you define a key, it is not enforced is a big deal. That's one of
Right.
the big, like, hey, this is your first decision tree point. I think when it comes to
Hmm.
where you're going to work and operate and manage your content, um,
Yeah.
because that type of management is so crucial to how we manage data that you have to be very aware of it. Okay.
Yeah, so let's tie that back to the conversation we've been having about multi-table transactions and
Yep.
stored procedures now, right?
Yep.
So you may define your primary keys, your foreign keys, they're not going to be enforced, but as you're doing some type of load, you may have a stored procedure that's going to load both tables, right? And then you're going to do a check for the data. Hopefully, you're not going to do all the data, right? But you're going to check the data you just loaded and say, hey, are all my foreign keys valid,
Yep.
right? And if not, I'm going to roll back both of those tables, right? I mean, or you can write the stored procedure having a different order of operations, right? But just conceptually thinking, that's one of the reasons of having a transaction and having things in multiple places. You may have, a stored procedure calling the other stored procedures to do the load, then a third stored procedure to do the check, and then roll everything back type of thing. So
Yep.
kind of think about it in that way that you're going to have to write that part of it. Okay,
And
so
I'll call out right here. There are a lot of people who have been talking about, well, hey, what about third party tools like DBT? DBT is amazing for that type of testing.
mhm.
So if you're using DBT, this is an awesome point and thing to do as part of your management and part of your workloads and processing. Do those tests before you load that final gold layer inside your medallion architecture, so that you know that you're not going to load something that like has even one duplicate record will cause your load failures and problems. So you got to catch that as part of your processing. Keep going,
Hmm.
Ken. Yeah.
All right, what did I do wrong here? Because this all worked earlier.
You can't say not.
Yeah, keyword not, or the not enforced.
Do you have?
I don't know that we're going to have time to show this now.
Okay. Well, all right.
Unfortunately, but
Yeah.
when this worked, um, on my model, oh, you can see some of it did work. Okay.
Yep.
So in this
So hang on.
case,
Here we have
let
a
me,
question. What's the benefit of creating these keys if it's not enforced? Ah
yeah,
ha ha ha
let me
ha.
move this table and zoom in. You can see it automatically produced my relationship from the dimension table to the fact table because I produced that foreign key. Now, what I did read, I read the documentation, I interpreted it one way, and then when I did it, it worked a different way. I thought they were going to make these relationships active, but they did talk about the issue of having multiple relationships back to the same table, right? And then
Hmm.
knowing which one should be the active and which one should be the inactive. So it seems like as of right now, they've chosen to put in all of these relationships as inactive. So you could just come over here and change it to active. And if you've done all your checking, you could say assume referential integrity. Did that not stick? Do I have to have it apply somewhere? Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Notice this little box over here of apply changes. I missed that.
Ah.
And so we're going to apply that. And now we see we have a standard relationship. It's documented into the database. That's the other part of it. Even if it's not just the relationships, I love finishing up code that produces you good documentation. Get your metadata right to get your documentation. And I
Amen.
see Mark had a question about what does DBT stand for. Do you want to cover that,
I'm
Chris?
looking that up.
I know we have at least one person that's very strong in DBT here. I don't remember what it stands for either, but
Dialectic behavioral therapy. That's not right.
no, that one I know as well because my
I believe
wife has
it's
studied
database
that.
tools,
Yeah.
designed to help you manage all of your data. It's really incredible. It is super great when it comes to managing your loads and your processes and interdependencies and putting in regression tests. It's got all of that stuff all set right up for you. I highly recommend checking it out. I understand they're working on a Synapse/Fabric connector, like a custom one
Hmm.
that's native built, but it does have data build tool. That makes much more sense.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks, Heidi.
yeah, yeah. It's great. So
And as Heidi mentioned in the chat, right, the default model is buggy. I would say it the same way. I have currently a love-hate relationship with the default model. I'm trying to stick with it and see, how it all works. I have seen it getting better over the last couple weeks. I did something with a Gen 2 data flow where I did replace tables, and every time I created relationships in my default model, they went away, and then I had to reproduce them. That's been corrected. But yeah, I think it's going to take a while to kind of get used to and see where else it progresses. Right now, use it as a way to kind of get queries back into it. If you happen to like that writing DAX queries, there's not a lot of people that write full DAX queries. They tend to write measures, but
well,
yeah,
I honestly, I would even say don't write DAX queries. Now you have T-SQL, the one of the most powerful, well, the most powerful query language out there. So
I
I'll even challenge the Italians on that one. That is,
I would agree, but I still like it. I'm weird. I enjoy writing DAX queries. They're fun to me. So I know I see
that
that look on your face.
that is weird. You're weird. Let's not let's not go down
That sounds like a good place to start
that.
wrapping up then.
Yep. All right.
Uh,
So to kind of sum up today, if you're just tuning in, if you want to watch the recap, please do. We covered a whole bunch of stuff. We started off going over the licensing costs, how this is going to cost you. Then we went into like why the heck would you use the DW or the SQL
mhm,
endpoint or the Lakehouse? How these all fit together, or even the the SQL data mart, right? How do these play all together? And I think we kind of articulate a good reason why data marts are still a thing. Why and when you'd use SQL endpoints, as well as when and why you use the SQL data warehouse piece. If we got it wrong or you disagree, leave the comments down below in the video.
mhm,
Let's keep the conversation going. You can either do it in the video, you can do it on LinkedIn or on Twitter. You can find both Kevin and myself in either of those places.
mhm.
If
Yes.
you have any topics that you specifically want us to cover, we got a whole list. Kevin is very diligent in coming up with a long list of things. Um,
But we're always willing to change.
yes, please let us know. We are happy to delve into different things. But right now, we're still exploring these options and we're exploring Microsoft Fabric. To address real world situations, right? Like I've got clients that I'm trying to help out. These are the things that we're talking about and we're working through. Kevin is in the same
Mhm.
boat. So this is like practical use cases for Fabric today, as well as exploratory of what we're going to be looking at in the future. So please let
Exactly.
us know if you have any questions or conversations you want us to have. Kevin, anything from your side?
No, you summed it up great. I see a lot of great comments and people post. Some of our friends that help out as admins posting some good links in the chat. So go back and see the chat once it becomes available. Thank you everybody for joining. Again, keep the conversation coming. We'd love to hear your
Oh
thoughts.
yeah, I forgot. Oh my gosh, I'm a bad YouTuber. Like, subscribe, leave comments. Holy cow. And if you like the t-shirts, help support the channel out, you can, that merch is available on the store. You can order your Fabric Fridays, the Flying F's, down below as well. All right, everybody, have a great day. Peace.
Peace.